Hello, in this presentation we're going to talk about backing up data within QuickBooks Online. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info. Here we are at the QuickBooks Online dashboard. We will be continuing with the Get Great Guitars problem. We're going to be talking about saving data and backing up data within the QuickBooks file. If we moved from the desktop version, are talking to someone who has used the desktop version, or anybody using any desktop version of accounting software, whether it be the QuickBooks Desktop or some other version, we'll get to the topic of saving data, backing up data, and restoring data. There's a difference, of course, between the online version and the desktop version in that the desktop version will generally be stored in some way that we will have control over it, most typically on our desktop or version or server, and therefore we have direct control over that data file, which is great because we then can do whatever we want with the data file. But it's also a concern because if anything happens to our server or if that file gets corrupted in some way, then we lose the file and we'll lose the data. Therefore, in the desktop version, our major goal then is to save that information in some other location, typically. And therefore, if, for example, we have the data on our computer, we might want to save a backup version on an external hard drive and or on a cloud-based software, so that if something happens to our server, that our computer crashes or there's a fire or something like that, we have the backup in some other location and then can restore the data back to the program. That's one use for the backup data in a typical desktop version. Now on the online version, we have a different scenario in that our data is actually being stored not on our server, but on Intuit servers somewhere, and therefore they have control of the data, and that you'd think that we'd have the same concern in that their server can burn down or can be corrupted, but it's actually less likely that that's going to be the case. So that normal kind of backup option isn't there on the online version, which can be concerning in terms of losing data. But the typical way that we would lose data is probably not the same type of risk, because of the fact that it's on the Intuit server, and the Intuit server is most likely going to be backed up very well. So it's less likely that we're going to have that problem where we just lose all of our data on the Intuit server. Now, there are some other concerns and some other things that are useful within the desktop version to have those backups that we typically don't have as much on the online version. We can talk about how to kind of simulate that type of information in the online version. But for example, if we wanted to have a backup and back up something at some point in time and have a static backup in the desktop version, and then do something that's a bit of a risky type of experiment within the software, and if it doesn't work, then restore our data to where it was prior to running some kind of scenario. That's an option that we have in the desktop version that is not there currently in the online version. We can't typically back up all of our data in the same way and restore it in the same way. So if we wanted to run something like that, it'd be more of an issue. The online version also, of course, if we stop the subscription, the data typically will still be there, but we typically would need to restore our subscription in order to continue with the data. So those are a few differences between the online version. The online version, as of now, doesn't generally have that static backup. So the static backup shouldn't be a problem in that the Intuit will have the data. We won't typically lose the data because it's on the Intuit server, but doesn't give us some of those other types of things that we can do, which is basically to have that point in time, frozen in time, that point backup, so that there's a problem in the future, we can restore, to that point in time that we've have control over. Now, there are a couple things we could do in the QuickBooks file in order to get our data to an on-ground version, and that, in essence, is just running reports. So we could go down here and say, hey, what reports would we need to run in order to get all the data that we want backed up in order to basically be able to reconstruct what we have if something went down in terms of the Intuit server going down, which is unlikely to happen, or if we wanted to try to transfer this data to some other software and do it in a manual process. How can we do that? Well, some of the reports we might want to have, one would be the transaction detail report. And we can go into the reports here and we type in the transaction list detail report, transaction list by date report. And if we run that report, and again, if you don't have any data in here, obviously there will be nothing here. But if we run that report 02/01/21 to 02/28/21 and run that report, then we'll get all of the activity. And this is going to be a nice report in that it gives us the amounts over here, and it gives us the transaction types that we have. So we can actually go in here and basically see not just by the account, meaning the balance sheet account and the income statement account, but by order of transaction. So we can go in here and actually see all the transactions that were input in a particular order, and we can save this information. And typically, if we wanted to reconstruct this month of information, we can basically put this information into the system. So this is one report that we can save that basically backs up what we have done for a current portion of time. If we were to run a report like this, we would probably want to run their financial statements, meaning the balance sheet and the income statement, probably prior to this time. Then save this report, which is the activity from that point in time, and then this activity, and then a balance sheet and an income statement as of the end of this point in time, the end of February in this case. And that'll give us the detail for this report. The other reports that would be useful in order to back up our data, get some of our information, the core information that would be needed if there was a catastrophe, a crash, if we're moving the data somewhere, would typically be our customer list and our vendor list. Customer possibly more important. So we're going to say the customer list, customer contact list. If we select that item, then it'll give us all of our customers. Now, we don't have a lot of detail in terms of the phone number, the email, the address in the customers for our practice problem, but those would typically be the most important things. If this is the area where a lot of your contact information is going to be for the customer, which I would put in multiple areas if we could. Any contact information, it probably going to be in our email information. I would duplicate it into our QuickBooks information and try to keep it as updated as possible. This is more information that would mostly be useful in order to basically back up, and we can save it as a PDF or export it. And then of course the vendor list would be the other. So if we go to reports on the left side and we go to the vendor list, here we have the vendor contact list. We'll get the same thing in terms of who we pay our to. Now, we might have less information here, but we may still want to put to our vendors the phone number, the email, and the address for the major vendors we have. Obviously, the phone bill and stuff like Verizon and stuff, we may not have all that detail too. But if we have typical vendors that we're purchasing our inventory from, so if we sell guitars, or the main vendors we buy the guitars from, and the contact within those companies are things that we would want to save and make sure that we have that information in terms of their contact information. So that's going to be the other report that will be very important here. So again, the major difference here between the online and desktop version is that the online version doesn't have that static backup that we can have on the desktop version. And on the one side, the online version is less likely because the server is very it is a high quality server on the cloud by Intuit, and probably has a lot more backup functionality than we may have on the local desktop. So it's probably less likely that we completely lose all the data by the server going down on the Intuit side. However, we still don't have some of those other kind of options that are nice within the desktop version in order to have that static backup, to freeze that information as of a point in time, to have a backup file, as of a point in time that we can go back to, or to run tests with different types of backup files and transfer that backup file possibly give it to our CPA firm or whatnot so that they can work on the backup file. The online version, of course, if we wanted to work with a CPA firm, we could just give them access to the online version. They can go through the online version and work through the reports, but we can't give basically a static backup file as of a point in time that the CPA firm can work on without accessing our actual data in real time that we're currently working on. So there's pros and cons to the systems that we're going to be using within the cloud-based system, QuickBooks being on the cloud-based system, and the desktop version with regard to that saving data and that restoring data. It's one of the big differences in terms of how we're gonna restore our data, how we're gonna back up our data, and how we can basically manipulate our data within the system.